We are back, and we are joined now by Jeff Schuhrke, labor historian, labor journalist, labor historian, assistant professor at the Harry Van Arsdale Jr. School of Labor Studies at SUNY Empire State University, author of the new book, Blue Collar Empire, The Untold Story of U.S. Labor's Global Anti-Communist Crusade. Jeff, welcome back to the show.
Thanks. Great to be back.
And congratulations on the book. We're so happy to have you on. It's funny because I was talking to Matt, our producer. I was like, is there a good book that you can recommend to me about that isn't entirely biased in this regard about labor and even the AFL-CIO in particular and its connection with Hoffa and some of and organized crime in that regard? And he was like, oh, Jeff's coming out with a new book, and it's particularly about the CIA and the Cold War in this in this area. But it is really, I think, the first time I've read a history of the labor movement in this way that isn't just basically about corruption broadly and nails down how the labor movement or the AFL-CIO in particular had this connection with the government that resulted in this degradation over these years.
Yeah, it's it's not a very, unfortunately, not a very like inspiring or uplifting kind of history, of labor history. But it is really important, I think. For many decades, and some could arguably say even still today, many of the top union officials and labor officials within the AFL-CIO and its affiliated unions were closely tied to the U.S. foreign policy establishment, to the State Department, the U.S. Agency for International Development, National Endowment for Democracy, and of course the CIA, which is where the sort of derisive moniker AFL-CIA comes from. That was kind of started in the late 60s when some of this came to light for the first time during the Vietnam War. A lot of these labor officials were especially kind of rabidly anti-communist because they had fought against communists and other leftists within their own union ranks for so many decades. And they were very eager to maintain a seat at the table with, and maintain sort of legitimacy and respectability in the eyes of the U.S. government, because they weren't particularly radicals in how they pursued unionism. They didn't like ideas of class consciousness or class struggle. It was more just about, having the right connections and having a more amicable relationship with bosses and managers at the bargaining table, and trying to be equals in economic planning and demonstrating that, like, look, we're loyal, patriotic citizens, and we hate the Soviet Union and communists as much as anyone else, or even more so. And and as you mentioned, it did kind of serve to lead to this kind of degradation in this decline in union density and union power, because as I argue, the AFL-CIO was so focused on waging this Cold War overseas and devoting so many resources and so much energy to this, while not organizing the unorganized in the U.S. and not fighting back against corporate America's attacks on the labor movement, and not being enthusiastic enough and sort of jumping on and supporting the various social movements that were happening throughout the 60s and 70s. I mean, there were some exceptions, but generally speaking, the mainstream labor officials from the AFL-CIO were not kind of doing the things that we would hope that they would do, and instead devoting so much time and energy and resources on trying to defeat any kind of left-wing or anti-capitalist or worker-led labor movement in pretty much everywhere around the world.
And right, it was really an assault on union internationalism. And I think that, I guess a good place to start might be the 1930s, right? When you see union density and that rise, and communism and communists being huge in that struggle, right? And their efforts in terms of labor organizing being central to building up that union density. Just take us through the Great Depression, the role that communists played here in the United States in labor organizing in particular.
Yeah, so obviously with the Depression, it was millions of people, working class people, lost their jobs, their homes, their life savings, and it was clear to a lot of people that capitalism just wasn't working, and so they were much more receptive to communism, and the Communist Party USA grew to unprecedented heights. Still marginal overall in U.S. politics, but much more influential than it had ever been, because it wasn't just about ideology. It was actually a very practical and well organized party, and they were especially active in organizing the unorganized in the labor movement and trying to be more inclusive, because before then it was very typical for unions to try to, especially the AFL affiliated unions, to exclude racial minorities and women and immigrants and so-called unskilled workers. And so the CIO was created in 1935 to kind of take advantage of the fact that, just like now, millions of workers were so eager to unionize. Unions were very popular. There was a lot more class consciousness because of the reality of the Depression. And the AFL was not taking advantage of that to go out and put in the resources to organize millions of workers in the auto industry and steel industry and electrical industry and others. So the CIO kind of broke away from the AFL and went about organizing these millions of previously unorganized workers and successfully unionizing the biggest corporations in the country at the time, which is sort of like the equivalent of if Amazon and Walmart and McDonald's were like unionized totally and wall to wall in a few years. Like, that's basically what was happening. And the CIO welcomed in, or at least tolerated, communist union organizers because they were such dedicated and effective organizers, whereas the AFL, having always been more conservative, had totally kind of shunned communists and other radicals. But the CIO welcomed them in the 30s and 40s. So then coming out of, after the end of World War II in 1945 and kind of the beginning of the Cold War, the rivalry between the US and Soviet Union, a lot of unions within the CIO were led by communists, or at least, communist fellow travelers and allies. And they were not eager to have this Cold War standoff. They thought this would only serve to benefit corporate America by being able to divide the working class and focus more on, militarism and war and imperialism. And the CIO leader, non-communist leaders, kind of made a political calculation. And obviously this is the period of McCarthyism and the Red Scare and the Taft-Hartley Act being passed, this broad anti-union law. So the CIO's non-communist leaders made this calculation that they would be better off just purging all the communists and expelling 11 communist-led unions from the CIO. And I think it was a really dramatic and unfortunate turning point for the labor movement, where things started to kind of go into decline. The CIO became a shell of its former self. It lost like a quarter of its membership through these purges, and then just kind of limped along for a few more years and joined the AFL to become the AFL CIO. And it was really kind of just crystallized with the CIO from the beginning that they were politically against any kind of leftism. It was kind of born out of the Cold War. And to some extent, that's still a problem. Like, another important book that recently came out is Hamilton Nolan's book, The Hammer, where he criticizes the contemporary AFL-CIO for not doing enough to put forward the resources and energy to help organize the millions of workers who are really ready to go. They're trying to organize on their own in many cases, and they just need some institutional backing. And it's not happening. And so I think that's tied to this history that I'm talking about in this book.
And the post-war period, that is right when Taft-Hartley also gets passed as well. So speak about that effort to, after World War II, discipline labor and how that coincides with this change in the AFL-CIO as well.
Yeah, because the labor movement throughout the late 30s and 40s had grown to unprecedented heights. So by the end of World War II, roughly 35% union density in the private sector. Like 1 in 3 non-agricultural workers in the U.S. was unionized. It's incredible.
Now we're in the single digits, right?
in the private sector, yeah, it's like a little less than 7%. So really an incredible moment. And yeah, the corporate America and the Republicans, business elites, and this was after years of the New Deal, as well as a lot of economic controls put in place during World War II. And so the business elites were like really eager to clamp down on the power of labor, especially after late 45 and 1946, the biggest strike wave in U.S. history, 5 million workers on strike to make sure that they could maintain good wages amid inflation after the war. And partly there was kind of this backlash to all these strikes. In 1946, the midterm elections that year, the Republicans took control of Congress for the first time since before the New Deal had started. And this Congress members included people like Joseph McCarthy and Richard Nixon and others like ardent anti-communists who were eager to make a name for themselves. And they directly tied opposition to the Soviet Union to opposition to the labor movement here at home, and passed the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947 over President Truman's veto. And the Taft-Hartley Act included all kinds of anti-union provisions saying unions cannot engage in the kind of militant strike actions that, like the sit-down strike, that had helped lead to all this union growth. And a lot of other things, but in particular, it included a requirement that union officers had to sign a affidavit swearing that they were not and had never been members of the Communist Party. And interestingly, it didn't say you have to sign an affidavit saying you were never a member of any kind of fascist party or Nazi party. Right. It was just Communist Party. And some of the CIO leaders and unionists, either because they were communists or because they were just sympathetic, or just didn't agree with this, they refused to go along and sign these affidavits, and that was part of the pretext for why they got kicked out of the CIO.
How did these anti-communist lawmakers build consensus to such a degree that they were able to get a bunch of Democrats on board? I know there were a lot of anti-communist war hawk Democrats. What was that guy's name that Biden says is his...
Scoop Jackson.
Scoop Jackson, yeah, his mentor on this particular front, or his ideological North Star as it relates to Israel. Anyway, Scoop Jackson was one of them. Like, how did that happen? How did this anti-communist consensus build to the point where they were able to override Truman's veto on this?
A lot of it was the fact that there, like we were talking about, in the 30s, the Communist Party USA was somewhat influential, and it did grow, and there were actual communists in the labor movement and in the U.S. government and the State Department and different agencies, and and there had been this World War II alliance between the U.S. and Soviet Union, and there was a sense from a lot of even Democrats, but Republicans especially, that that this sort of paranoia and hysteria was that there was truth to it, and that the country really was in some kind of peril. And of course, the military-industrial complex was starting to be built up around this time, and there was it was sort of the military mobilization and the need for wartime production that had pulled the economy out of the Depression during the war, and a lot of obviously, of course, a lot of military contractors, but also politicians, members of Congress, wanting to make sure that there were jobs in their districts, got behind this idea of the military-industrial complex, and we needed to have a more and more military buildup, new innovations. Now there was an arms race with the Soviet Union, and all these justifications given for ever more military buildup and never-ending war, essentially, got tied to economic policy and political considerations for getting elected. So I think it was a lot of factors. Someone like Scoop Jackson was especially prominent more in the 70s. And part of it, his thing was just really ideologically anti-communist, which is true for a lot of the labor leaders of this whole Cold War period, kind of true believers that, that they were really focused so much more on this idea of so-called democracy. And I think it's they use democracy and freedom as just kind of these euphemisms. I don't think it was because you often see them backing like right-wing dictatorship.
We do that to this day. We do that to this day.
Right. But a lot of the labor leaders were so much more focused on this battle of democracy versus totalitarianism, and not so much interested in the battle between workers and bosses, like, which is really what the labor movement should be focused on, I think. It was much more like there were all these, you mentioned labor internationalism at a lot of international labor conferences, and the creation of different international labor bodies that the AFL-CIO was supporting. They made sure that all the discussions were about, like, how do we fight the communists? How do we isolate the Soviet Union? How do we undermine left-wing forces? Because it wasn't just about actual communists. It was just anything that was slightly to the left of center was just branded communist and beyond the pale, in Latin America and Asia and Africa, in Europe, everywhere. And so at these like international conventions, so much of the discussion and focus was on like these Cold War questions of geopolitics, and not so much about how do we empower workers, how do we curb the power of corporations, and things that you would think labor movements should be focused on.
So it's an era of labor liberalism in a sense, and you talk about how the AFL-CIO became increasingly invested in the Cold War aims of the government as the 50s and 60s roll on. Just take us through that period of change and how, at the end of the day, the AFL-CIO got subsidized, right, by the government, in order to push them in that direction.
Yeah, the AFL, before it merged with the CIO, the AFL's leaders were really true believers in the anti-communist cause. And even before World War II was over, when the Soviet Union was still our ally, the AFL was already it was creating this new international arm called the Free Trade Union Committee, which was going to it sent representatives to Western Europe, to places like France and Italy, where communist parties were pretty popular, to try to divide the working classes of those countries, to say, create rival, separate anti-communist splinter unions that were going to be pro-US. And so the AFL was kind of doing this on its own before the US government even really got in on the Cold War itself. While the CIO was a little different, like I said, and they were kind of pushed into, because of McCarthyism and Taft-Hartley, the CIO kind of more gradually and a little bit more reluctantly got into the Cold War. And then the two merged in 1955. But a lot of these union officials had been fighting communists in their own ranks for many decades. And they saw themselves as the real experts in how you fight communists. Even they thought they knew better than even the CIA in how you do it. And, with communists and other left-wing anti-capitalist movements around the world, their base of support often is the working class and unions. And so unions were seen by the government, by the US government, as like a crucial battleground in the Cold War. Like, if we want to win, if we want to isolate the communists and other leftists, we need to make sure that the labor movements of various countries, from Europe to Latin America to Asia and Africa, have to remain firmly in the US camp. And they saw how the AFL and the AFL-CIO had already been doing some of that on its own, and thought, well, these guys know they can open doors we can't. Like a lot of these CIO officials were like Ivy League educated WASPs who didn't know anything about the working class or how to talk to workers, but they knew people from the AFL-CIO who were actually came out of the working class, and they could open doors. They could talk to union officials in places like Mexico or Argentina, or France or Italy or Indonesia. They were kind of going everywhere, which is the book kind of covers multiple continents over multiple decades. But eventually the AFL-CIO and the foreign policy establishment, the State Department, CIA, USAID, they all became kind of closely enmeshed. And yeah, the AFL-CIO received lots of money, millions of dollars from the US government to carry out various programs, like ostensibly a lot of educational training programs for workers overseas that were about collective bargaining and union administration, but also like how to keep leftists out of your union ranks, how to respond when someone comes to the union meeting and starts speaking out against Yankee imperialism or whatever, how to shut them down and shut them up. and also funneling a lot of money into like small scale community development projects in parts of Latin America and Africa, of like to say like if you were a member of one of these anti-communist pro-US unions in another country, you could actually materially benefit with like a new health clinic in your community, or affordable worker housing that you could have access to if you were, loyally in the U.S. camp in the Cold War. So the AFL-CIO, there was a lot of this was the money and resources was coming from the U.S. government, but the AFL-CIO was, funneling it and working it as the face of it to labor movements abroad.
Is that how some members of the mafia get involved here? Just in the sense of like, the CIA had relationships with some members of the mafia as it related to, like, I don't know, attempts on Castro's life, and because of their issues with him shutting down the casinos in Cuba. Like, these connections go back, and to me, it just, like, I was thinking back to growing up, what you hear about unions. There are a lot of people that would just say, oh, corrupt, the mafia's involved, etc. Like, how much of that was a big part of this dynamic that you're describing, of reorienting the labor unions under this Cold War incentive structure?
So I don't get into that too much in the book, really. It's a great question, and there's a book, I forget the author's name. I think it's called Murder in the Garment District, that came out a couple years ago, that does touch a lot on like the international ladies garment workers in New York, and they were kind of infiltrated by the mafia. But there are there are some examples that come to mind. I mean, for one thing, the CIA was working with the AFL-CIO and these unions in France, anti-communist unionists in France, and the French dock workers in the Mediterranean, to try to, because some of the more leftist dock workers wanted to, in the 1950s and 60s, obstruct weapons that the French were sending to Indochina during the Vietnamese fight for independence. And so some of the leftist dock workers wanted to stop sending arms. They wanted to obstruct the shipment of arms. And then the CIA, working with the AFL and anti-communist groups, hired like gangsters and mafia people from like Corsica and other places to come in and like rough up these dock workers and throw them into the port to make sure that the flow of weapons would continue going to Vietnam. And then from this connection, or from this came the French connection, this heroin trafficking networks that the CIA and AFL had kind of been connected to early on, of like heroin grown in Asia being moved through French ports and then into the United States. And another example that comes to mind has to do with the creation of the State of Israel and the Zionist militias in Palestine, like the Haganah, and how they were, effectively waging a war of ethnic cleansing against the indigenous Palestinian people. But there was an arms embargo over Palestine in 1948 that the U.S. and UK had imposed to try to limit the bloodshed. And in the U.S., people like Meyer Lansky, the notorious mafia leader, mobster, who effectively controlled the East Coast ports, he was a big supporter of Zionism and wanted to, and so was like Jimmy Hoffa and some of these people in the Teamsters, and they worked to smuggle weapons out of the U.S., and out of the New York and New Jersey ports to Palestine to arm Zionist militias. So there's some of that as well. But like I say, that's not something, I don't know quite as much about that history. It's not something so much in this book, but it's definitely, I think it is connected, and there's some other good stuff out there that people should read.
Well, that's fascinating. I mean, it's hard to disentangle what's an attempt to discredit labor and what's actually legitimate. And so that's why I wanted to kind of pick your brain in that regard. So just some lessons that you want in the midst of kind of this labor renaissance, or a more favorable environment for organizing, at least currently under this administration. What would you say to unions, maybe as it relates to like taking funds from the State Department, or what this history says about how the labor movement can learn going forward?
Yeah, I think ultimately, to put it simply, I think unions should not be taking money from the State Department, which unfortunately they still do. The AFL-CIO does even now. But I think like this is a moment where many workers are very eager to unionize, and the establishment of the labor movement should really put its power and resources into supporting that. In this history that I've written about, so often, like a huge amount of the AFL-CIO's budget, up to a quarter of the budget in the 60s, was going towards these foreign policy issues, and they were taking millions of dollars from the U.S. government to carry out these Cold War interventions overseas that ultimately only harmed workers both at home and abroad, because it made it easier for multinationals to offshore and to outsource and send production overseas to wherever they could pay workers the lowest, because a lot of the unions in some of these different countries in Central America and the Caribbean and Asia, the labor movements there had been divided and weakened in part because of the AFL-CIO's interventions over so many years. And a lot of the more progressive pro-worker governments around the world, even democratically elected governments, were overthrown in these coups, places like Chile or Brazil and other places that the AFL-CIO had supported, which I write about in the book. And ultimately, it made it so much easier for corporations to be able to divide and conquer. And so many of the resources the AFL-CIO had in the mid 20th century, when it really was powerful, when there really was 35% union density, and the biggest corporations in the economy were fully unionized, instead of using that power to continue organizing the unorganized and bringing racial minorities and women into the labor movement, and hindering militarism and war and building up a more robust social welfare state. Instead of doing all of that, the AFL-CIO was focused on how do we defeat the left in all these different countries around the world. And I think that internationalism is vital and necessary for the labor movement. So I'm not saying the AFL-CIO and unions should not be involved overseas, but it should be more in the spirit of genuine solidarity. And that means often having to be in conflict with U.S. foreign policy and some of the things the U.S. government is doing overseas, especially obviously in Gaza, right? It's been really important to see so many unions come out, not only calling for a ceasefire, but also more recently, 7 major unions representing about half of all union members in the country have been calling on Biden for an arms embargo on Israel. And it's become even more clear why that's necessary just this past week with the war now spreading into Lebanon. Joe Biden has been good on many union issues, the National Labor Relations Board and other agencies, and just in his rhetoric as well, with the exception of the potential railroad strike a couple of years ago that he shut down. But it's been, interesting, not surprising really, but to see that, the unions are saying to him, on matters of war and peace that are really urgent and important, and how working class people's taxpayer money is being funded. They're saying, stop sending arms to Israel. And he's just ignoring them completely and only approving more billions of dollars in weapons. So I think that's going to sort of, this wasn't your question really, but it's going to kind of tarnish his legacy as, the so-called most pro-union president ever, when the unions are begging him to take a better stance on the most critical foreign policy issue today, and he's just ignoring them. Exactly
right, Jeff. So we're going to be talking in just a second a little bit more about what's going on in Lebanon, but really appreciate your time today. Jeff Schuhrke, labor historian, journalist, author of Blue Collar Empire, The Untold Story of U.S. Labor's Global Anti-Communist Crusade. We'll put a link to that beautiful book wherever people are listening to or watching this in the description. Thanks so much, Jeff. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.